And this is a story for Dean. So this is from the Brothers Grimm. And this is a book called Tom Thumb's Travels. So once there was a tailor who had a son who was very much on the short side. In fact, he was no bigger than a thumb. So they called him Tom Thumb. Even though he was so small, he was a gutsy fellow and said to his father, "Father, I feel as if I have to go out into the world." "You're right, my son," said the old man, who took a sewing needle and made a little handle at the end of it with melted sealing wax. "And here you have a sword to take with you on your way." There's little Tom Thumb and his father and mother. His father made him a sword out of a little needle. Our little tailor wanted to have one last home-cooked meal and skittered into the kitchen to see what his mother was cooking. The meal was ready and his bowl was keeping warm on the hearth. "Mother, what are we having to eat today?" he asked. "Take a look for yourself," she said. So Tom Thumb leapt up on the hearth and peered into the bowl. But he stretched his little neck a little bit too full, and the steam rising out of the food lifted it out the chimney, and he rode the hot air for some time before he finally sank back down to earth. Now the little fellow was out in the big, wide world. He wandered around and eventually became an apprentice to a master tailor. There was food, but there the food was not good enough for him. "Mrs. Taylor, if you don't give us better victuals," said Tom Thumb one day, "I shall leave, and tomorrow morning I'll be back to write on your door with white chalk, 'Too many potatoes and too little meat. Auf Wiedersehen, potato queen.'" "You've got some nerve, you little grasshopper," she said, getting mad. She grabbed a rag and tried to swat at him with it. But our little tailor slipped nimbly under her thimble, and then he looked out from underneath and stuck out his tongue. The master's wife picked up the thimble and tried to snatch at him, but Tom Thumb hopped onto the rag first. As she unfolded to try to find him, he jumped into the crack of the table and said, "Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Taylor!" he cried, poking his head out. And when she tried to squash him, he dove into the drawer. But finally, she cornered him and chased him out of the house. So here is Tom teasing and running from the tailor's wife. So he roamed about once more until he came to a great forest. There he ran into a band of robbers who were planning to steal the king's treasure. When they saw Tom Thumb, they thought, "Such a tiny little thing could crawl right through the keyhole and be our picklock." "Hey, you giant Goliath," one of them called out. "How do you like to come with us to the king's treasure room? You can crawl inside and hand the money to us." Tom Thumb thought for a minute, finally agreed, and went with them to the treasury. There he searched the door up and down for a crack, and before long he found one wide enough to just crawl through. He was just about to wiggle through the crack when one of the watchmen at the door noticed him and said to the other, "What kind of awful spider is just crawling over there? I'm going to squash it." "Oh, let the poor thing be," said the other. "It hasn't done you any harm." Just then Tom Thumb slipped safely through the crack into the treasury, opened the window, and began to toss one silver coin after another to the robbers below. He had just begun to work at a solid clip when he heard the king coming to check on his treasure, so he dashed into hiding. The king noticed instantly that some of his silver currency was missing, but he could not fathom how it could be. The door had been tightly bolted, and as usual, everything was kept under lock and key. The king left the room and said to the two watchmen, "Be on your guard. There is someone after my money." Once Tom Thumb resumed his work, the watchmen could hear the sound of the money moving and clinking inside. Clink, clank, clink, clank. And they burst in, thinking that they would catch the thief red-handed. But our little tailor had heard them coming and was too quick for them. He scampered into the corner and took cover under a coin. And he began to tease the watchman, calling out, "Here I am!" And they ran towards the voice. By the time they got here, he was already hiding under a coin in another corner. "Yoo-hoo! Here I am!" And the watchman hurried over, but Tom Thumb was long gone. And from a third quarter, he teased, "Yoo-hoo! Here I am!" And again, he made fools of them and had them running in circles around the treasury until they were worn out and finally left. He was able to get back to work, tossing the coins one after another out the window. When he heaved the very last one with all of his might, then leapt onto it and flew out the window on its face, the robbers sang his praises. "You're a real hero," they exclaimed. "Do you want to be our leader?" Tom Thumb thanked them kindly, but said his plan was to go to see the world first. So they divvied up their loot, and Tom Thumb asked for only one small coin, since that was all he could carry. There's Tom Thumb, hanging out with the robbers, divvying up the loot. He strapped on his sword again and bade the robbers farewell and set off on his own two little legs. He worked as an apprentice to several different masters, but had very little appetite for the work. Finally, he was hired as a servant boy at an inn, but the maids could not stand him since he always saw the mischief they were up to, and without knowing he was even there, he could tell the owners what they'd stolen from the guests' plates and took for themselves from the cellar. "Just you wait, they'll teach you a lesson," they snapped, for they had planned to play a prank on him. A short while later, when one of the maids was mowing the garden and saw Tom Thumb jumping up and down in the weeds, she mowed right up to him in the grass, bundled up the cuttings in a towel, and secretly fed it to the cattle. There was a big black cow among them, and she swallowed Tom Thumb along with the grass without hurting him. But he did not like going down inside her at all, since it was terribly dark, and there was not a single candle burning anywhere. While the cow was being milked, Tom Thumb cried out, "Strip, strap, stroll! Isn't the bucket already full?" But the sound of the milking was so loud no one could hear him. Soon the innkeeper came into the stall and said, "Tomorrow that cow is to be slaughtered." Understandably, this made Tom Thumb quite afraid, and he cried out in a shrill voice, "Let me out! I'm stuck inside!" The man heard this, but did not know where the voice was coming from. "Where are you?" he said. "In the black one," Tom Thumb answered. But the man could not understand what he could possibly mean, and he walked away. Indeed, the very next morning the cow went to the slaughterhouse. Fortunately, Tom Thumb did not suffer during the chopping and hacking that followed. Instead, he ended up being among the sausage meat. And as the butcher came over and began his work, our little man screamed at the top of his lungs, "Don't hack so deep! Don't hack so deep! I'm right down here within the meat!" But not a soul could hear his cries over the noisy chopping. Now he was in dire straits, but his panic gave him strength, and our little fellow ran and hopped right through the army of chopping knives and got through without a nick. So, here's the butcher chopping up the meat to make sausage, but luckily, Tom Thumb was able to get away. But even so, he could not escape entirely, since he couldn't see a clear way out, so he got stuffed into a blood sausage with the very last pieces of meat. These new quarters were really tight, and to add to the predicament, he was hung out in the smokehouse, where time had seemed to stand still. He wasn't taken down until winter, when his sausage was to be served to guests. The minute the innkeeper's wife began to slice it, Tom Thumb had to take great care not to stretch his neck out too far, lest he lose his head. Finally, seeing the light of day, he seized his moment and burst right out of the sausage. He had no desire to stay in a house where he had been treated so poorly, so he struck out again on the journey. But his newfound freedom was not to last very long. Out in the open fields, he crossed paths with a fox, who snapped him up without a second thought. "Hey, Mr. Fox," called the little tailor. "It's me who stuck your throat. Let me out." "You're right," answered the fox. "You're hardly the meal I was looking for. Promise me the chickens in your father's yard and I'll let you out." "I'm more than happy to," said Tom Thumb. "I promise you every chicken in the coop." So the fox let him out and even carried him home. When the father saw his little boy again, he gladly gave the fox all of the chickens he owned. "It's not all a loss," said Tom Thumb. "In return, here's a nice piece of silver I brought you." And he handed his father the small coin he had earned along the way. "Why, oh, why did that fox eat those poor chirping chickens, you might ask?" "Aha, you silly! Your father, too, would be much happier to have his child home than to have all of the chickens in his yard." So there they are, having dinner with the fox. His parents so happy to have him home. The end.